I'm a historian, as you can tell by the introduction, so you'll be forced to listen to me talk a little bit about history as an introduction to these people who've lived history. I've sort of studied it, they've lived it, so it's a nice sort of balance. And they are the experts tonight. I am here just to help facilitate that and to pivot every once in a while. Hopefully ask some provocative questions that they haven't been asked before that'll get them thinking about their experiences slightly differently. And one of the things I wanted to add is that you were absolutely right that we are at the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. However, it's interesting to know it's 150th. 100 years ago, in 1913, Harriet Tubman died. 100 years ago, in 1913, Rosa Parks was born. So this date has a lot of significance to it, and I think a lot of importance for us to keep in mind. And the things that happened in 1963, I think, were an important connection to those ancestors who came before us. Now, what we want to talk about tonight will be about civil rights in the 1960s with some focus on the March on Washington movement, since this is its 50th anniversary. And what I thought would be useful to talk a little bit about is the background to that and understanding the context of it in which these distinguished individuals participated in it and other civil rights activities. Because in many ways, the 60s is a real rise in the level of civil rights activism in this nation. And it's really spurred by the younger generation who's changed it, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit. But the advantage that we have now, looking back over 50 years, is that we know that there was the March on Washington in 1963. And we have the hindsight to know that it was a very successful march along the way. That it was the largest march ever on Washington, D.C. at that time. 250,000 people showed up for it. And it really was a high point in the history of civil rights movements in this nation. It was a time in which people were very excited and hopeful and positive about the possibilities of the future. But the reality is that for those people who were there at the time, all this was not known. All this was things that they would have to learn about later. And in fact, that period of time was one that was very unsettled, and the outcome was not clear at all. In fact, with the March on Washington itself, there was a lot of concern about whether or not this gathering would work out very well. In fact, when it was first proposed by A. Philip Randolph, they got together and had a conversation with the president at that time, who was JFK, John F. Kennedy, and his attorney general, who was Robert Kennedy, his brother. And they both tried to discourage this group, the Big Six as they referred to them, from having this March on Washington. Kennedy had just proposed a civil rights bill in Congress on the heels of the Birmingham marches in 1963, and he was worried that this kind of a march might hurt the ability to pass that civil rights bill. So he was trying to discourage them from doing that, but they didn't pay attention to it. In fact, they believed they should go forward. Now, one of the things of concern was that they worried there might be violence that could take place with this gathering. Here you have this large-scale movement of individuals into Washington, D.C., and there was a worry that maybe violence might break out, and violence from a different kind of quarters. Possibly violence from among the protesters themselves, if something happened and it got them angry. But also worry about violence from outsiders, segregationists and others who did not like what was going to go on in Washington, D.C., and might come in and try to cause problems for those people who were gathered in the city itself. Now, as we know in hindsight, that did not happen. In fact, it was a very peaceful, wonderful day in the history of this nation. And it was highlighted by the speech given by Martin Luther King of I Have a Dream, which really sort of set an agenda and a vision for the possibilities of where this nation might go. So when we look back, it was a really wonderful moment. But there were lots of things going on during this time period, I think, that we have to understand might have blocked, might have impacted how that turned out, but also gives us a sense of where the civil rights movement really was by 1960. Now, there are several different organizations who had to come together to organize and to execute this March on Washington in 1963. Among them was the NAACP. Now, the NAACP, up through the 1950s, had probably been the leading civil rights organization in the United States. And in fact, its approach had been to use legal action, court cases, to begin to change segregation laws and to change the attitude of the courts and maybe the nation about segregation. And probably the highlight of their activities was the Brown versus the Board of Education decision in 1954. It really was a highlight for them. A victory after more than 20 years of a variety of court cases and actions trying to change how the courts looked upon the issues of segregation in the schools. This for them was a highlight, an important moment, and they really were enjoying that. But that focus only lasts for about a year. 1 year later, in 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott takes place. And out of this emerges a new leader, this young minister from the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church by the name of Martin Luther King. And he then becomes a spokesperson and the individual that many people turn to talk about the civil rights movement and the changes taking place. This does not make the NAACP happy. One, because they feel like he's a Johnny-come-lately. They've been doing this since the turn of the century. And now he's getting all the attention. But in a more practical way, they're worried about the fact that they survive on donations and on money coming in, and worried that this will drain some of the money away from their legal efforts. So they have some concerns about Martin Luther King. In addition, what King then becomes a part of is a new organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is created in the 1950s. And this becomes then the go-to organization for many people around civil rights. So first of all, we have this competition that exists between SCLC and the NAACP. Now you add to this the fact that in 1960, another new organization comes into existence. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference thinks that it believes that it needs to create a youth arm to its activities, where the younger people can have some input and involvement in civil rights movement in a real kind of way. Now what emerges from the conference that they call is a new organization called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, formed in 1960. Now what's different though about SNCC is that when they first come together, they were going to be a subset of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But at that meeting, they decide that people like King, who's over 30, and others, back then it was old, we're not moving fast enough. That they were using a very traditional, move slowly, work with the different people in power, change approach. The students in SNCC who are high school, college, and even younger believe that in fact you need to have more activity, you need to have more direct action, you need to create change more rapidly. They wanted freedom now, was a word heard very often, phrase you heard very often. And so they became an alternative group to SCLC and NAACP in terms of how they were going to push for change. What sort of kicks this off are the sit-ins and the lunch counter sit-ins that begin to happen all across the country. The earliest ones take place in Wichita, Kansas, and in Greensboro, North Carolina. But most of you didn't know about Wichita, Kansas, did you? You all heard about Greensboro, but in fact, Wichita was a little bit earlier than the one in Greensboro. But what it signified, I think, is the stepping forward of this younger generation to cause changes. And with these sit-ins, you begin to see them sweeping across the country. And younger people saying we need to force change more directly, more rapidly, is happening before. In some ways, we're talking about direct action. And what emerges then is a wave of sit-ins all across the country. They even take place here in Virginia, and some of the individuals here in this panel were part of it. The ones that got some of the main headlines in Virginia during this time period were the lunch counter sit-ins in Arlington in 1960, where they sit in the People's Drug Store lunch counters in Arlington, Virginia, where the waitresses ignore them, serve their whites, and walk away. But finally, they're able to force the store to close and eventually to integrate its lunch counters. You also have picketing taking place in Richmond, Virginia, where they picket some of the largest department stores down there, and students, again, are in the middle of this activity. And what they do is to encourage customers to do selective buying, basically to boycott these places in order to force them to change their ways. In the same year as the March of 1963, you have sit-ins taking place in Farmville, Virginia, just outside of Richmond, where again African-American youths are doing sit-ins at 5 of the stores there in order to try to force them to change what's happening. And then others here will tell you about other sit-ins that took place in Virginia during this time period. So we see this sweep across the country, and it's fueled by this younger generation who is not willing to accept change coming slowly. So if you look at this landscape, and you look at these individuals and these organizations, you have the NAACP, you have the Urban League, which I didn't mention, you have SCLC, you have Core of the Congress of Racial Equality, and you have SNCC, all now coming together to form this group to organize the March on Washington in 1963. Clearly, they have a united sense of change they want to have happen, but they have different viewpoints about how that's going to occur and different, very strong feelings about themselves. Now, the person who proposes this march in 1963 is A. Philip Randolph. He had organized the sleeping car quarters years before. In fact, he had organized the March on Washington in 1941 that had forced President Roosevelt to change his policies about hiring people to work in war industries and making sure that people of color were hired into these jobs. So he says now we want to do this again in 1963. It's the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation and a chance for us to bring pressure to bear on Congress in support of Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill. His belief, though, is that to do this, we need to emphasize jobs and economy. He's a union person, and he thinks economics is the core way of doing this. Well, people agree, but they don't think this is the main focus. King believes that you need to look at civil rights, and changes, and segregation as a key point and focus of this. So they start off with a disagreement. Eventually, they come to some compromise on this, in which they decide to have the march focus on freedom and on jobs as a sort of collective approach to this. So that at least this first piece of the puzzle is fit together. But then the whole idea is, when do we have it? Where do we focus our attention? And what will be the strategies that are employed? NAACP does not want to have demonstrations. They don't want to have sit-ins. They don't want to have a wide variety of things. They want it to be very calm, very controlled, so it doesn't disrupt the momentum in Congress. King wants to have sit-ins. He wants to have demonstrations. He wants to make it a more active kind of engagement. And the students at SNCC want to do even more than that. They want to disrupt things. They really want to make sure that there is no business as usual in Washington, D.C. How do we force them to understand how we're feeling about these things? John Lewis, who is now in Congress, was the leader of SNCC at the time. And he is very adamant about the fact that he thinks the Civil Rights Bill is too little, too late. And it doesn't protect enough of the issues that are confronting people in the civil rights movement. So he wants to figure out how do we force it to go forward. So going into the organization of this, you have these very clearly different points of view about what should happen in this March on Washington. Now, the person who's able to make this all come together is Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin is a trusted advisor to both King and A. Philip Randolph. He's a homosexual, and this worries the NAACP.
Yes, he is.
Yes, he is. Well, I think he's passed away now, but he was president. But he's an excellent organizer. He's been involved in civil rights activities since the 1930s, in the early days. So he really understood how to do this. He was a trusted advisor. It goes through him. He's able to get people to begin to compromise and come together and focus their attention on having this march in Washington in August of 1963. There are a couple of things he has to take care of, and a couple of glitches that emerge out of what he organizes in terms of this meeting. The first thing is that as he organizes it and the program is put together and it finally happens, there is a major omission in the operation of the program itself and the involvement in the program itself. Have any of you ever seen the program for the March on Washington? Did you all actually see the program? Well, if you take a look at it, there's this interesting issue that women do not play a prominent role at all in the program. They also don't play a very prominent role at all in the organizing of the march itself. Women are allowed to perform as artists, and there is a tribute on the program to women freedom fighters in the civil rights movement, but that's about all that happens in terms of their role in it. And this leaves quite a few women unhappy. And in fact, there's a protest directed towards Bayard Rustin and towards the marchers, saying that in fact, here we're having a march for freedom and equality, and you are allowing tokenism in the treatment of women. So this becomes a real issue that gets smoothed over. But I'm reading the autobiography of Dorothy Height, and what I find very interesting to read an autobiography is you go through her entire life, she doesn't really mention the March on Washington in 1963. I kept figuring out, why doesn't she do it? Well, I think it was her own way of protesting the mistreatment of women in that march, and the fact that they were left off the podium. And in fact, if you look at pictures of March on Washington, Dorothy Hyde is right there next to King. If you've ever heard her speak, she is one of the most powerful speakers that exists. And the fact that she was left off it is still sort of an amazing thing to me. So this is one glaring problem that they have with the march itself. The other one is that SNCC and John Lewis really want to give a speech that's fiery. They want to give a speech that is condemning of this nation and also condemning of Kennedy. Like I said, they don't think his civil rights bill has much to offer in terms of change and real protection for civil rights workers. And it's not until the very last second that they're able to persuade him from not giving that very fiery speech. In fact, he tones it down and gives a speech, which he still is pretty critical, but not nearly where he was. So that these changes, I think, help to allow the march to go forward and to have the kind of success that we expected. An interesting side note is that one of the other issues was, when do we let King speak in his program? NAACP didn't want him to go first because they were worried that after King, everybody else is going to sort of, it's like an after. So I thought, what we're going to do is we'll put him at the end, and maybe even so that by that time the newscasters will have left and they'll miss it. Well, they didn't. And he gave his I Have a Dream speech, which I said really creates this vision for the possibilities of the future. And I think give a capstone to the March on Washington itself. Many people have seen the March on Washington as the high point of the nonviolent civil rights movement. That here is where the dreams, the hopes, and aspirations are highest. Expectations are very high, in the hopes that what will follow is the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, and that the nation will change the way that it is operating and thinking about these issues of segregation. The difficulty is that these hopes and dreams were very quickly dashed. That by the next month, in September of 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama, 4 little girls are killed in a bombing in a church going to Sunday school. This dashes, I think, people's feelings. On top of this, the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, decides not to prosecute people they think might have been involved in this, say they don't have enough evidence. Well, this is just more than people can stand. And you have violent outbreaks taking place in Birmingham, and a lot more anger beginning to build in the African American community. And you begin to see at least a larger amount of conversation about militant self-defense and direct action in other kinds of ways. And so, in some ways, as we look at the March on Washington in 1963, we can think about it in 2 ways. One way you can think about it is as a time in which the hopes and dreams of nonviolent civil rights activism reaches its pinnacle. And in fact, the hopes that the world is going to change. But on the other side of it, you have the fact that indeed it doesn't change. And things in the South go back to the way they were before, and I think you begin to see a greater militancy emerging in the African American community. So as we pause to think about the March on Washington in 1963, and we think about all the wonderful things that happened that it did, we also have to see it as this real sort of important moment in time in the history of this country, the history of civil rights, because I think it marks a shift and a change. Because after that, you have the bombing in Birmingham, you have the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and a series of other deaths that follow after that that remind us that violence is still a very important part of what we are about. I offer this to you as an overview and a backdrop to our talking more about civil rights in the 1960s and the March on Washington. As a backdrop, as we learn more about the personal experiences and the personal stories of the individuals we have before us, who I think we're very fortunate to have here because they can tell us directly about what people were thinking. Not giving you sort of the historical overview, but what gives them its power are the personal reminiscences and the personal experiences of those people who were part of it. So from this point onward, my task is to be the moderator and to help move the conversation forward. And I'm going to start off with the first request of each of you is to take a few minutes and talk to me about what you were doing in the 1960s and what the March on Washington possibly might have meant to you, and what kind of activities you were doing in terms of thinking about society and trying to make a difference. And I'll begin with you.
Good afternoon, good evening. First, I would like to thank the Fredericksburg Museum and Cultural Center for having us here this evening. It is indeed an honor, and I'd like to pay homage and gratitude to our predecessors. If anybody had told me back in 1960 that because I wanted a new skirt and my hair straightened to go downtown, that it was going to turn out that I would be in this situation today to speak to you about what that experience was like to walk downtown with my friends and neighbors with picket signs. My goal is to tell you what it was like in Fredericksburg to sit in 1960. I was a junior in high school, and one of the most prominent things that we had was a committed community. We had parents who were involved and who wanted more and better for their children. And then we had the NAACP, who would speak up, and my brother was a leader in that group, and I'm proud of that. So with that, it came to me somebody came to me one day and said, we want to go downtown, we want to go and talk about having some sit-ins downtown. And I had never really thought about it. I knew that we were separated, and actually it was kind of all right because I had never come up against anything that made it any different. But what I was going to get out of it was to go down to Grant's, where I couldn't try it on in the store, and buy a skirt. And I got my hair straightened on a night other than Saturday night for Sunday's church. So that was what I was about. Now, I want to go on to say that I had heard of some stuff that was going on, and I heard about people like Roy Wilkins, Dr. King, James Farmer, who was right here in Fredericksburg and was an activist, and he spearheaded a lot of this stuff. I heard about them, but they didn't have any impact on me until Mrs. Todd and Mamie Scott and other people sat down with us and told us the meaning of what was going on all over the United States, and particularly in Fredericksburg. So they sat with us, and first I want to let you know that very few people had cars. Very few people had TVs. And downtown Fredericksburg was the hub, but there were no malls, there was no McDonald's. So I learned this, that people came downtown, white people came downtown to eat and to mingle and go about their day. We came downtown, we went to town on Saturday to purchase what we need for the big day, Sunday, and we go back home. We don't tarry. At that same time, we had 2 theaters, and we could go to the theater, but we had to go upstairs where it was dark and the seats were torn up and it was smelly. But there were times, and I read this in a book that my best friend Gay wrote, that I don't think I was part of this, but she probably was. She'd take, what was the name of that candy? Jujus, and throw them down on the white people. So that was one advantage, and the other advantage of going to that, good goodness. The advantage of going there also was that the movie was air conditioned, and we knew nothing about that. So we would go there and pay our quarter, depending on your age, and we would sit there as long as we could. So we didn't know anything about mingling, and we really didn't know anything other than to fight. So everybody couldn't go downtown like my brother Bobby. He would have never made it downtown, and Mr. Todd, my best friend's father, couldn't make it downtown either. So anyway, in case you haven't seen, if you'll hold that up, in case you haven't seen this, that's me at 16, and I think Gay must have been 15 because she was always behind in years but ahead in education. So, but that's us walking downtown and in the 60s. So anyway, so what they did was they met with us and told us what kind of clothes to wear, meaning our predecessors, our families, told us that no matter what, you cannot fight back. No matter what, you cannot curse, you cannot do anything. And that's what we did. I had an occasion to, where did we go downtown? I'm trying to get some order in this. We went to Grant's, Newberry's, Woolsworth, and Peoples, which is now CVS. Okay, and we did go to Gulrig's. It's my show, okay. But anyway, we did go to Gulrig's. But the reason why we didn't go to all of the other places and didn't stick around Gulrig's long is because we didn't have many people. I told you everybody couldn't qualify to keep their mouth closed. So that's what we did. And I was small, and at first I was not fearful because I had the new skirt and the bangs and stuff, so I wasn't afraid. But when I heard "come out coons," and when people spit peanuts through a straw and hit me in the face, and they blew smoke in my face, and when they hurried up and put a blanket on a stool when I'm just getting ready to sit, it's a blanket there, and I wasn't able to sit, I became afraid. And I remember carrying out God's will and my family's will and the community's will, even in my fear. I don't remember knowing the full impact until years later, because things didn't get good right away. And then we started carrying the posters and the signs, and that was the picket and the boycott. And what we did, the impact that we made, and why we picked these chain stores, and why I told you that that's where white people went to eat, because we want to cut them off in the pocketbook. The waitresses couldn't make money. The suppliers couldn't deliver the food. I mean, they could, but who's going to buy it? And there were some whites who were sympathetic, and they would not cross over the line either. So those people who were not sympathetic became fearful too. They didn't know what might happen if they did. So that's that picture that you saw of us walking. If God is for us, who can be against us? That type of thing. So again, I could not believe that people could be so cruel, and they were always trying to be one step ahead of us. We would have 2 seats in between, so we would take every third seat. So if a white person sat down, he had to sit next to a black person, some kind of way. But there were white organizations who came down, and they would take the blankets off of the seats, and they were allowed to, the stools, and sit. And then when they got up, they would hurry up and give it to one of us, and we would sit down before anybody could put another one there. And that's how we made it. This lasted for about 3 months during the summer. The last incident that I remember clearly in my mind was People's Drug Store. That was the one that just would not give in. And I remember this man blowing smoke in my face, and I remember Mrs. Todd touching me saying, it's okay, because I was ready to blow up. And then I remember years later, after being the first black to receive a scholarship from Mary Washington Hospital to go into nursing, I remember coming back to Fredericksburg specifically to help the blacks, and so the whites could be proud of what they produced. And I thought because the sit-ins were over, everything was okay. But there was a black floor and all that kind of stuff that went along with it. But what I want to say is the manager or the owner of People's Drug Store was my patient. And he was really sick. And I didn't think long, but I did think. I did. I speak an honest program today, so a couple minutes ago I would say, I did this and I did this. No, I thought about how mean he was to me as a child. And then I thought about I'm an adult. And my purpose in life was not to hurt, but to heal. So I was able to take care of that gentleman. So in conclusion, I would like to say that it was very scary because I was small in stature anyway, but I'd always been able to speak out. But that was one time I was really afraid, and it left an impact on me. Even now, but it's more subtle and it's not as often and not as intense, but it's still there. And I have to be forever aware of it. So that's what it was like for me.
I'm Dick Toye, and my story, I've listened to Mrs. McConnell here and Dr. Crew, and my story is quite different. I didn't participate in any sit-ins. I didn't demonstrate. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I was not a young person at the time in 1963. As a matter of fact, I was old. I was 36 years old. And relatively speaking, Dr. Crew mentioned the young people. Ms. McConnell here has mentioned she was 16 years old. There was no way at 16 years old that I would have had the nerve to march, to demonstrate, or to do anything else. As a matter of fact, even at 36, I would not have done it. Thank goodness for TV. We did have a TV, and I will tell you that TV played a major part in the civil rights movement. If it wasn't for TV, I'm not quite sure where we would be with regard to the civil rights movement. But it changed a lot of minds, including mine. I did watch TV. I watched what was going on in the South with regard to the civil rights movement. There was some opposition and controversy among the people who formed the March on Washington. However, there was another group out there, and let me call a few names. There was Stokely Carmichael. There was Rap Brown. There was Malcolm X. They were totally opposed to Martin Luther King's way of conducting the civil rights movement. As I said, I watched TV. I didn't think very much of Stokely Carmichael, Rap Brown, and Malcolm X. They were not the side that I would choose. Martin Luther King and the other six, James Farmer, Whitney Young, Philip Randolph, John Lewis, Roy Wilkins, that was my side. I did make a choice, and I had to go with that group. They were the ones that I thought would do the most for the civil rights movement. As I said, I didn't have the nerve. I could not go south and be on the bus. I could not go register people. Frankly, I was afraid. And I will tell you, even today, I do not look forward to going south, no further than Virginia. And I have a problem there. My wife happens to be white. She has a different way of thinking than I do. I'm an old person. I'm 86 years old. The world has changed. This country has changed. It has changed so fast that I am not able to keep up with it. I've seen so many changes in this world and in this country that I'm not able to keep up with it. My wife occasionally mentions going south. She thinks nothing of it. Me, I'm afraid to death. there is no way that I'm going to take a white woman down in Alabama, Georgia, or Mississippi. And I'm serious. I'm sure that that fear is embedded in me from the civil rights movement. I have watched Bull Connors on TV, George Wallace standing at the schoolroom door. I have heard statements from Stokely Carmichael, by any means necessary, from Malcolm X, the chickens will come home to roost. Those things were all fearful to me. I interpreted those remarks as meaning, kill them all. That was not a part of me. On the other hand, however, when I would see these things in the South, I felt like going to the South, but I couldn't do that. I was married. I had adopted a young kid. I had a family. I had a job. I was working for the federal government. And, I just could not give that up. It wasn't within me to do that. And yes, that fear was still there. I couldn't do it, and I didn't do it. On the day of the march in Washington, I was at home. I was not part of any planning. I was not part of any group, but I had to do something. I just decided I'm going to march on Washington. I did. I went downtown. I just jumped in a group. I remember somebody shoved something into my hand, which was a placard, Jobs Now. They gave me a little hat to wear, and I put it on, and I marched. On the spur of the moment. It was the only time, the only participation that I made with regard to the civil rights movement. I played no other part. But after that, I did change. Martin Luther King's speech, it did something. I changed. Some of the fear did leave. And it was a big change for me. I became outspoken. I wasn't afraid to speak to anybody. I wasn't afraid to say what was on my mind. Prior to that, I was. But that civil rights movement, the March on Washington, did make a big change for me. As a matter of fact, the materials that I did use in that march are in the Smithsonian right now. Dr. Crew, I believe you worked for the American Museum of History. There was a curator there that collected materials, and I believe occasionally you put on an exhibition of the civil rights movement, and my materials are in the Smithsonian. I was an employee at the Smithsonian at one time. In Washington, D.C., I didn't encounter a lot of sit-ins or marches. Washington, D.C. was considerably different from Fredericksburg or many other towns where there were marches and sit-ins. Washington, D.C. was segregated. We had different schools, we had different churches, we had different everything else, department stores and so forth. But it was, I guess, one of these things, segregation, it was one of these things where you kind of, during my time, you accepted it. We did. And we lived that way. But we also had good schools, we had good movies. And you've heard of Howard University, U Street, so on and so forth. We fared pretty well in D.C. And I'm not quite sure that we had the same situations as many other towns and cities where there were sit-ins and so forth. I remember many of the names during that time: Julian Bond, James Farmer, Whitney Young, A. Philip Randolph, John Lewis, Roy Wilkins. Dr. Crew mentioned Martin Luther King's speech. John Lewis also made a speech at that time. However, whomever made a speech at that time, they were overshadowed by Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And that, I think, changed me a whole lot. As a matter of fact, I do a lot of speaking today. And I think I try in many cases to emulate Martin Luther King. There's a lady here tonight that wrote me a little note and said, I can't do this exactly as she stated it, but she said she was glad to be a part of history. And this is here in Spotsylvania County, of course, based on a speech that I had made before the Board of Supervisors. And I think that I was able to do that, and I was inspired because of Martin Luther King's speech. And I do quite often make speeches now, and I'm forceful. I say what's on my mind. I write, and I write what's on my mind. I do a lot of volunteering here in the community, and somebody put a tab on me as a community activist. Whatever that is, it's fine with me, but I do participate in many, many activities here in the community now, and I do quite a bit of work. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Carole Hamm, Carole with an E and J as Johnson. I'm very proud of the E and the J. Anybody that knows me know I will tell you. My story is a little bit different, I guess, than all of them. I also was with Jerine and Gay. I was a little bit older than they are, just a year. I graduated in '60. And in '60 I wasn't afraid in Fredericksburg. I didn't think anybody in Fredericksburg would actually do anything. I participated in Fredericksburg because that was the thing to do during that day and time. If you were anybody but anybody, when they say sit in, you sat in. And most people can't believe I kept my mouth shut, but I did. But my fear came in Petersburg with the dogs. When I was at Virginia State College, we sat in, and because there were so many students, they couldn't put us all in jail, so they carried us to a gym. And in that gymnasium, the police wasn't enough of them either, so they had these dogs. And the floor was hard, and if you shift, the dogs would growl. So you didn't shift very much because you didn't know whether one of them would let them go or not. Like I said, I was afraid in Petersburg. I wasn't a... Shift. Yeah, not that other one. Not that other one. Anyway, the dogs it was a lot of dogs, and they growled a lot. And like I said, I was afraid then. This is when I became serious about sitting in and what to do, because those dogs made you serious. I didn't know the people there like I knew them here. I mean, most of the time here, whether you were white, green, or orange, you knew. And as I tell people, I say we had a different kind of segregation. We had people on Charles Street. If you lived in the 1400 block of Charles Street, they were white on one side and black on the other. If you lived in the 1500 block of Charles Street, it was white on one side and black mixed in between. If you lived in the 1300 block, half of the block would be black and the other half would be white. So it wasn't nothing as far as mingling with white people. So I wasn't afraid there. But like I said, when I got to Petersburg, I sung a different tune. I didn't have as much mouth as I had here in Fredericksburg. But anyway, like I said, we were on the gym floor in one of the schools because there were so many of us. And we were afraid as a group. Even though numbers were strengths, I think most of us were afraid because we didn't really know the people in Petersburg. In Fredericksburg, as Jerine said, you could go to a theater. You might have to sit upstairs or whatever, but you could go. In Petersburg, you couldn't go into it. That was the difference. The drive-in theater that some of you remember, it's not there anymore. That was never segregated. You got in your car and wherever you wanted to park, you parked. Whether it was 20 of you or 21, because it was a carload for $1.20, I believe. So wherever you wanted to park, you could park. But in Petersburg, you could not go into the downtown theater. So that was a little bit different than we had experienced here in Fredericksburg. Then I went on to the march in Washington. I was really serious then. But anyway, I was more conscientious of the fact why I was there. And then it was just so many people. There were people everywhere. I mean, I don't care where you went, where you didn't go, there were people. People all over the place. Orange, green, purple, green, there were people. Millions and millions, looked like trillions to me. But there were people because there were so many of them. Then 20 years later, I had some children. And I thought this would be a great experience for them to go to what I had experienced 20 years earlier. And as I told some people, I say, I really think the only thing they remember is that a bird got in our car on 95. And we were fighting to get it out. But they might remember something else, but I think that was the greatest part of their day. Plus the fact it was hot. It was real hot. And I had these two news reporters to follow me. They followed me from Fredericksburg to Washington and went through the whole march with us that day. And they came back and wrote an article and said that I said that, in other words, that Reagan didn't care for black people, which I probably did say. I can't remember. That was over 50, more years than I choose to remember. Let's put it that way. But anyway, and they wrote that in the newspaper, and some people asked me about it. I said, well, he wasn't there. He didn't even come out when we did the march or anything like that. So I wasn't afraid to speak my mind. And even though they wanted me to say something different, he wasn't there. And I don't believe he liked black people. And I can understand sometimes.
Who's that?
Your president, President Ronald Reagan? Yeah, yeah. Reagan, however you pronounce it. But anyway, that's the experience that I've had with the civil rights movement. Plus, I've tried to help in a small way for our children here in Fredericksburg, help them to understand that it has not always been possible for us to go and sit down at a restaurant and eat and order. All we need now basically is the greenbacks. But then if you had the greenbacks, you still couldn't go. It wasn't always possible to go to any school you wanted to. Ye wanted to take, was it physics and calculus, trigonometry. But it was one of them. And at Walker Grant, which I'm very proud of Walker Grant, that's the best school in the United States. But anyway, it depended on the alternate year whether you could take trigonometry or algebra. If you came in on the odd year like I did, you had to take geometry before you took algebra. And everybody that's in any school takes algebra first. But we had to take geometry first because we only could have it every other year. And if you could only have it every other year, then if you came on that odd year, you went hurt. But we had a great teacher named Louise Lucas, and she stayed back to teach us algebra in the evening so we could pass geometry on our tests and different things like that. So these are the things that they take for granted, but we know for a fact that there were people out here fighting for them. We had people like Dr. Wyatt, Clarence Todd, Mildred Queen, Dr. Harris. They were out there fighting for us and steered us in the way that we should go. So I just want you to know that even though Fredericksburg wasn't the greatest city in the world, it was much better than a lot of cities. So that's what I have
to say. Good evening. My name is Gordon White, and when I was here back in the 60s, they called me Sherman. You know, buddy. I'm going to take a little different stance. We're going to go across the water to Stafford County, and we're going to talk about the integration of school, or the attempted integration of school. So back in 1960, that was my senior year in high school. I graduated in 1961. September 1st, 1960, 5 of us attempted to integrate Stafford High School. Now, prior to that time, no one had attempted to integrate, to our knowledge, any school system in the area. The attempt was denied, but it led to total integration in Stafford beginning in 1962. Even in 1961, there were 2 young ladies that were admitted, but the total school system began integration in 1962. Let me just go back and tell you how this all began. It began during the school year 1959-60, and there's a fellow sitting in here, his name is Gary Mercer. We were called to the principal's office, and I don't know why we had to go to the principal's office, but it was something mischievous, and Reverend Edward Smith, who was a resident of Fredericksburg, pastor of New Hope in Stafford, and the principal of Poole School, he had called us in for some mischievous reason, and when we got there, we were ready for him to lower the boom, but he began to talk about education. Now, you need to know a little bit about Poole School. Prior to 1959, Poole School only went to the 10th grade. Those individuals, those black students in Stafford who wanted to complete their 11th and 12th grade, they had to come to the city to Walker Grant to finish their 11th and 12th grade. The county paid for them to come the 11th and 12th grade. In fact, I got 3 older siblings that finished Walker Grant, and I finished Poole, and then I have a younger one that finished Stafford High School. And during that time when Reverend Smith called us into his office, he said to us, you all think about education. You don't need to go to Walker Grant to get your education. You can go up on a hill. Well, we called the white school up on a hill because we were in the bottom of Eskimo Hill, and Stafford High was on the hill in Falmouth. And so he said, you can go up on the hill to get your education. He said, why don't you go home and talk to your parents and see if they would allow you to put in an application. And he said, I will help you, but I can't be out front, because if I'm out front, I will lose my job. He said, but I will give you support from the back. Now, you remind me, we were 16 years old, 16 and 17 years old at that time. And so we went home, talked to our parents, and we came back and our parents consented. So then Reverend Smith gave us the name of 3 lawyers in Richmond. I think it was Tucker, Marsh, and Hill. And they were civil rights, civil rights lawyers. And they advised us of a couple of things. First, you need to go up and pick up an application. And then you need to hold a meeting in the county. And once you hold that meeting, we will attend the meeting, but we can't come to your county and tell you what to do. So someone of age must stand up and say, we want to integrate the schools in Stafford County. Well, we couldn't find a place to hold a meeting. No one wanted to allow us to hold that meeting. And so finally, I asked the pastor of my church, Bethlehem Primitive Baptist Church in White Oak, I asked my pastor, could we hold a meeting there? And he said, sure, hold a meeting at that church. And so we held a meeting, and 2 of the lawyers attended. I don't know which ones was Marsh or Hill or Tucker, but 2 of them attended. And Gary and I were supposed to have been leading the meeting and getting somebody 21 of age or older to stand up and say, we want to integrate the schools. Well, we didn't know how to do that. But we talked around and around, and no one stood up. So finally, Gary stood up and said, we want to integrate the schools. And we got the lawyers here to help us. Well, that was a no-no. But they got up and they began to talk, and finally someone stood up and said, we want to integrate the schools. Well, I was a school bus driver. During that time, you could drive the school bus at 16 years old. So all of my brothers, my brother Frank, John, they drove the school bus, and then they handed it down until they got to me, and then I handed it down to my brother. So at 16 years old, so you had to go to Stafford High School to pick up the application. I went up to Stafford High and walked into the principal's office because I was the bus driver. The bus barn was right behind Stafford High. Walked in and I said, I want 2 applications to transfer schools. It just so happened that the principal was in the office, and he said, what school you want to transfer to? I didn't want to tell him I want to transfer to that school, so we went around and around, and finally I said, you know what, I want to transfer to this school, so I want to pick up 2 applications. He said, let me talk to you. He said, you know what? He said, I think if you picked up 1, then I think that you'd be good, so you could come up here and break the ice. I told him, nope, didn't want to do that kind of pioneering. So he said, and we talked about sports and all this kind of stuff, and he said, tell you what we can do. We can put up some bleachers in the end zone and football games, and you can bring your friends up here and you all can watch the game. I said, Mr. Durham, you misunderstood everything I said. I don't want to come up here and watch. I want to come up here and play. He said, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. Well, we went back to pool. I picked up those 2 applications, and some of our classmates learned that we were applying to go to Stafford High, and some others wanted to go. And in fact, 5 others decided they wanted to go to Stafford High too. So I went back, picked up 5 more applications, and Mr. Durham again was in the office, and he said, y'all get ready to turn it out down there, right? I said, yeah, we're going to come on up here. We filled out the applications, and like I said, we had our meeting, and 3 things happened that summer. 3 things. 1, Reverend Smith, they found out that Reverend Smith was helping us in the background. And so they terminated his position or his job that summer. They fired him as principal of Poole School. They named Dr. Anderson as the principal. That's the second thing. And one of the first things Dr. Anderson did was to contact me because he had heard that I was the leader of this movement, and he thought he could persuade me not to follow through with my application or to withdraw the application. And so he sat down and talked to me, and he said, you know, you're a senior, and if you go up there now, you're going to be hurt psychologically for the rest of your life. So why don't you withdraw, and you don't need to go up there. Well, that did not persuade me. And then Mr. Gale, T. Benton Gale, who was the superintendent at the time, he sent all of us letters. And in that letter, it outlined all of the things that were going to happen at Poole. I mean, we were going to be a university by the time. And they were even going to change the name of H.H. Poole. So once I got the letter, I decided, you know, I'm not going to take the time to go up there. We're not going to do this. The day before school started, I get a call from Gary. And he said, Sherman, what are we going to do tomorrow? I said, we're not going to do anything tomorrow. We're going to Poole. He said, that letter didn't say we couldn't go to Poole. That letter just outlined all the things that they were going to do at Poole. That letter didn't say we couldn't go at Poole, couldn't go to Stafford. I said, look, Gary, let me call the lawyers. Because I was in constant contact with the lawyers, Jenny. So I said, let me call the lawyer and let me see what they said. So I called him, and he said, read me the letter. So I read the letter over the phone, and he said, you know what, they're expecting you tomorrow. I said, go on up there tomorrow. I called Gary back and said, let's get together and go. So remind me, there was 7 of us now. Well, Gary began to call, and I called. 2 backed out. So we had 5. Now, how are we going to get there? I was supposed to be driving the bus. I couldn't drive the bus up there because I had to pick up the other students. But I had a cousin, Johnny White, and my brother John hadn't gone back to college, and so he decided he drove the bus for me that morning. I borrowed my cousin Johnny's car and drove up. One student couldn't get to pool. We decided we were going to pick everybody up at pool. One student couldn't get to pool on time, and so I went to Hotwood or Roseville or somewhere. I picked him up with my cousin's car, and I went to pool and picked up the other 3. And we drove to Stafford High School. We got to school, and I parked. We got out, and we were walking 5 abreast toward the front door. The first person to see us was a young female student. And she said, look, at niggas, they coming to our school. I got jelly in my legs. I looked around, and we were walking 5 abreast. But I looked around, I was out front by myself. They were walking 2 by 2 behind. We got almost to the door, and the school secretary came to the door and met us. And she said, Mr. Durham is expecting you. Come on in. We walked on in, and the lobby was full of white students. Full of white students. They didn't seem to pay us any mind. They ushered us right on into the main office and into the principal's conference room. Got into the principal's conference room, and Mr. Durham, the principal, came in, and he said, you know, if it was up to me, I'd put you in classes. He said, but I can't do that. He said, I'm going to have to call the superintendent. And so he asked the secretary to go call the superintendent. She disappeared. She came back in just about a minute. Never mind. I want to remember, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have anything like that. When she came back, she said, Mr. Gale has already heard, and he's on his way. Mr. Durham said, I tell you what, I've got to go in to address the assembly, because the students were gathering. The paper said gymnasium, but they were gathering in an auditorium. He said, I'm going to turn the loudspeaker on so you all can hear. So the 5 of us sat in the conference room. Now, let me tell you, we were all big jokesters. We had a good time at pool. And pool was very small, very, very small. I don't think there were 300 students from 1 to 12 grades, I don't believe. And there were only 16 in our class. So, but during that time, no one said a word. I can't even remember a word was said from the time we left pool going up to Stafford High. No one uttered a word. In that room, no one uttered a word. So Mr. Durham on the loudspeaker, I remember they began the assembly with the Lord's Prayer. And then he said something like, by now you've heard we've got visitors in the building. We don't want you to feel ill will toward them. They're here because they want a good education. They're not here to harm you and stuff like that. And I was kind of feeling pretty good. Well, then in comes Mr. Gale. And he didn't know the other 4, but he knew me because I was a bus driver, and he knew my family, he knew all, and so he directed everything to me. It was like he was looking right at me. He said, Gordon, did you drive the bus this morning? I told him, no, my brother drove the bus. He said, I thought y'all had withdrawn your applications. I said, no. And then he was nervous. Now, we were scared, but he was nervous, and he dropped the applications he dropped the papers on the ground, on the floor, and I reached down and picked them up and gave them to him. And he said, well, these have to go to the pupil placement board, 3-man pupil placement board in Richmond. And y'all know about the 3-man pupil placement board, that they decided whether black kids could go to school with white kids during that time. And so he said, well, what y'all have to do is to go back down the pool until you get a response from the pupil placement board. And then he went on back into the outer office, and he went on to address the assembly. Now, we could hear all of this on the loudspeaker, and he was saying, if it was up to me, y'all wouldn't have anything to worry about, because they would never come up here. Now, we were listening to this. And then some other gentleman came into the outer office. He wasn't in the assembly. He was in the outer office. And he said, we can't have them up here. He said, one rotten apple spoils the whole barrel. So we were here listening to that. By this time now, the assembly was over. Mr. Durham came back in. And he said, well, I'm sorry, you all have to go back to pool. And until we get an answer from the pupil placement board. He said, but I tell you what, y'all stay in here because the press is outside. And so we want to get rid of the press first before you come out. So here we sat, and finally Gary said, Sherman, why are we sitting in here? We're not scared of no press. I said, well, you know, you're right. So I said, come on, let's go. So we started outdoor. I started to the door and got to the door, and they said, the press is still out here. And we said, that's all right. We're not worried about the press. We stepped out, and that's when they took a picture, and the big headlines across Freelance Star, 5 Negroes attempt to integrate Stafford High. We went on back down to Poole, and then that stopped everything down Poole. Everybody came out and wanted to know what happened. But what happened as a result of this, we encouraged all the underclassmen to apply. The next day, it appeared in the Freelance Star that we could not be admitted to Stafford High because you had to have your applications in 60 days prior to the beginning of school, and we were 3 days late. They said we were 3 days late. That's what they said. So we encouraged everybody, and there's a whole lot of stories in here, but I'm trying to cut it short. As a result of what we did, the NAACP, the Civic Association, and the lawyers that we had contacted, they got together with the citizens here in Stafford, and in 1962, Stafford integrated fully grades 11 and 12. In 1963, they fully integrated grades 8, 9, and 10. And in 1964, they integrated grades 1 through 7. That was the first integration in the area, plus the fact it's the only one that I know of. Now, you may know of others, but the only one that I know of that integrated from the top down. Most schools integrated grades 1 and up. In Stafford, we integrated top down. Thank you. That's my story.
It's a hard act to follow. My name is Becky Reed, and I'm going to talk to you about the Fredericksburg Council on Human Relations. We moved to Fredericksburg in 1965, and we had lived in Richmond previously, and we'd been members of the Virginia Council on Human Relations, and it was formed, quote, to encourage better race relations, unquote. And we worked on things like opening public accommodations, going to restaurants, trying to get them integrated. We worked on desegregation in schools, voting rights. And there were chapters of the Council on Human Relations in various counties around. And I was very glad to find that there was one in Fredericksburg. Now, I think the Council on Human Relations might have been the most integrated group in the area. I can't think of others that were mostly made up of probably about an equal number of black and white people in the area. And we did things like, in May of '68, we had forums for the councils, for the candidates of city council. And before that, when Martin Luther King was killed on April the 4th, 1968, there was, of course, much unrest in the city, particularly among the young black men. And various people, including people in this room, and probably a lot more that I don't know about, including Buddy Hamm, Lawrence Davies, and Johnny Johnson, Wilbur Chance, the Browns, set about trying to keep things calm. And the Fredericksburg citizens, including the Council on Human Relations, organized a peaceful march from Mount Zion to St. George's Church to express our distress and to work for unity. And there was a program at St. George's Church where both black and white ministers spoke. We had a program in December of '69 on 7th grade history books. The 7th grade history books, that was the grade that you taught Virginia history in, gave you the idea that slaves were happy. So we had a program about that. In May of '69, we asked the Biracial Commission, which had been formed in Fredericksburg, to seek fair housing laws in the city. The officers then, and many of you will know them, were Wilbur Chance, George Young, Loretta Jones, Robert Montgomery. And then in January of '68, the Council on Human Relations came out with unanimous support for the City Council's open housing resolution, and we printed information sheets about the Fredericksburg Fair Housing Law, and we distributed it in churches. In January of '69, we founded the Children's House Nursery School. It was the only racially and financially integrated school like that in the area. And in April of 1970, ground was broken for the Hazel Hill Apartments, which is an apartment complex at the end of Princess Anne Street in the city. We were the first nonprofit in Virginia to receive HUD funds that's Housing and Urban Development Funds for housing. And this was sponsored by the Council on Human Relations and Shiloh Old Site Baptist Church. Reverend Davies, Bill Scaife, and I were the three primary facilitators. Before that, we had tried to get builders to build some housing that was affordable, and you could get tax credits for doing that, but we couldn't find anybody that was willing to do it. There may have been somebody out there, but we couldn't locate them. And that's when we began to try to explore other ways of getting some affordable housing in the area, because there was very, very little. And that's how we came to build the Hazel Hill Apartments. I was very proud of what the Council on Human Relations was able to do, and I think it made a real difference in the area. One other thing, and Gay and I were talking about this at dinner tonight, we had a program in December 1969 called What Color is History? Maybe you have an answer. Thank you.